Welcome to PPM Podcast Episode 1, Connie Klemme. Wow, this is exciting because Connie and I had talked about this podcast, the need for this podcast, and Connie's the greatest person to have for episode 1. She has a wealth of experience as a team lead on a project, as a technical lead, as a project manager, or even consulting with her clients when she wasn't even on a project. Her default position on any topic is, I'm interested in that, or I have something to contribute to that, and she certainly does. And when I met her several years ago, as we were working on a project that she was also working on, she was another vendor on the project, I just knew immediately that I loved this gal. And so today, several years later, we are friends. We've been friends for years, worked on many projects together where we collaborated. And even, in real estate, she's amazing. She's a great storyteller. And I'm just going to give you a warning that you're going to really enjoy her story. She has a lot to say. My husband teases her, calls her Magellan, because she circumnavigates the story. But that's not to say it's a disappointing trip. It's a great trip. And I hope you really enjoyed this episode with Connie Klemme.
What's the use of knowing true north?
But I just wanted to ask you which way I ought to go.
You get so caught up in restoring the galaxy to its rightful state.
I understand you're trying. You may be trying too hard, or you're not trying hard enough.
Always with you. Cannot be done.
Confront the problem. Fight. Win.
Whatever it is we look forward to.
It's gonna be a bumpy ride.
Practical Project Management Podcast.
Hey, Connie, I wanted to thank you for joining me today, our first in the series of Practical Project Management that you and I have talked about for years. You're welcome. I wanted to devote this episode to project sponsors, and I know for many projects you've worked on, you've dealt with a variety of different project sponsors, and I wondered what your thoughts are about. Let's just start off. My first question is, what percentage, roughly, of course, not scientific, of technology project sponsors, and let's qualify them that they have a budget over $10,000, what percentage of them do you think are actually prepared for their role?
I think it's very low. And it's interesting because I think when you qualify them in that group of over $10,000, you see the percentage go even lower than the group under $10,000 because of the nature of the organization that the project sponsor works in. Typically, that's been my experience. There could be other organizations that are structured differently, but my experience has always been state and federal government when you're at that level of a budget.
So you're saying under 10,000, it would actually be a higher percentage.
Yeah, I think so.
Like in the commercial side or the private sector for smaller project, that maybe the project sponsor is more hands-on. Maybe that number is kind of the dividing line between. Is that what you were thinking, or?
Yes, yeah, because that's been my experience. Because in the smaller group, they're more in tune. It was their baby. They wanted to do it. Whoever the sponsor is they were the driving force in the project's existence. And in the larger organizations with a large budget, often the project sponsor is somebody that is ladder climbing or has been handed someone else's project. It seems like it was a little more rare that they were, once the project takes off, that they were the person that initiated it and that it stayed involved. But even when that's the case, they just don't. My experience has been that it's a low percentage that actually understand their role. They just want this thing to happen and got some money for it, and they've handed it off to a project manager and think, okay, go make it happen. And I don't have to, just tell me when it's done and I'll be happy about it.
So where do you think that failure is? Is that, because if you're talking about federal and state, projects, and if you're talking a formal project, you've got a budget of some type of size, then who's failing in the preparation of the sponsor?
I'm not sure. If it's just the culture of what we think project management is, that the industry hasn't defined what's the sponsor's responsibilities. So they don't, they're not in tune with, they just know that they have a thing they want and they don't know how to get it, but they know that project manager over here is supposed to be an expert in how to make this thing happen.
What are some of the worst experience? Do you have any examples that come to mind of, the least prepared project sponsors?
Well, see, that's the thing. I had some very large projects, and as a project manager with the state in the past, and I can't tell you who the project sponsors were for the biggest ones. Like, I'd have never met the project sponsors. So I can't really give you experience of what did that person do wrong, because I didn't know who the person was. And it was just some mystery person that, read my status reports.
That's right. I forgot that you were actually in a project manager position. But
Yes.
What about thinking back when you worked as a contractor on a project? Were there any projects there that really the lack of preparation for the sponsor really was harming the project or made it more difficult?
One comes to mind that's a good example. But again, the ones that were harmful, the project sponsor was not clear to me who that was.
Wow. So you had a project, either you were managing or you were part of the project and you didn't even know the sponsor?
Yeah. I knew the contract monitor, like there was a person who was tasked with making sure that we were following the contract and the agreement, but they still weren't the project sponsor. And that person often was misguided. They were so busy being the project policeman that they would often get in the way of the goal because they didn't have the vision of what the goal was.
Well, who did?
I don't know that anybody did. I think that's why some projects struggle the most. One example that comes to mind, I didn't know who the project sponsor was at the beginning, but what I saw my project manager meet with a representative on the other side that I don't actually think was the project sponsor. They were the person who project sponsor handed things off to, and they became
like the SME, the subject matter expert, perhaps.
Yes, and we were fortunate because the subject matter expert was truly driven to make it happen because they lived down in the weeds. They understood the problems, or they came from the weeds and they understood the problems of the worker down in the weeds that had the problems. But they also were now in a position of management and they could see the 10,000 foot view and they could understand, okay, well, we need to unburden the worker of the things we can unburden them of, but we still have to hold the worker accountable. And that's a balance that you don't see in project sponsors very often, because if they didn't come from the weeds, they tend to ignore those critical things of how do I unburden the worker, and they just look at technology. I'm not really explaining this like I mean to, because
I think what you're saying, see if I've got this right, that what you're doing on a project is driven by those goals that were envisioned by the project sponsor's organization to begin with. And
yes.
The subject matter experts, if you're given, representatives that only have the management goals in sight, but they've never actually worked the processes or they're not close to the processes, then maybe they can't represent the change that needs to occur. So do you think then, are you saying that that's why you have two different roles? That's why you have a subject matter expert. That's why you have the project sponsors. Because, if you have only leadership that says we're going to, by golly, this has to be cutting edge technology, and ignore the subject matter experts, then you don't have the balance that you need to steer in the project.
Yes. Yeah. And So there's two projects that I can think of that come to mind that's very easy for me to speak on. One was a fantastic project sponsor, and one was a very disconnected project sponsor. So Mike Fisher, was an amazing project sponsor, had the project for training when the state agency first moved from mainframes to personal computers for their workers in this department. They selected a clerical person from every county to become a new, I think they were called social program technician. There was some goofy title, but these were women mostly who knew very little about computers, and they're suddenly going to become the computer expert in their county because they had the most knowledge they knew how to use the fax machine and the printer, and they had more knowledge than anybody else, and this was the only way. So they're going to have to train these people and catch them up on technology before the rest of the county gets done. And he was instrumental in that, and he was involved, and he understood that he's dealing with middle-aged people who've been doing this job for half their life, and suddenly we're introducing technology to their paper job. And he stayed involved with a project manager, and he actually came to some of the classes to see what it was like. At that time, my role was I was just a trainer and nothing more. And I was one of 10. But by the time at the end of the project, they kept asking me to come back to do special classes because he had money left over. And he recognized that, well, we trained them all on the little checklist that, some IT consultant recommended that these are the checklist of things they learned, but they still had huge gaps in their knowledge. And he used the leftover money to make customized classes because he was focused on the goal, not on the checklist. And he was interactive, and he was aware, and he attended the project meetings. He didn't just read the reports.
So the difference between him and the contract monitor is making sure things like checklists are happening.
Exactly. And he's looking at, are we accomplishing the vision? Because he sees we have 77 counties, and in every single county, my selected expert is, I would say, there wasn't one in every county. There were several counties that had to share this expert, but they were all middle-aged women who learned how to use a computer as an adult. And they knew how to do their job, but how to use a mouse and a keyboard, that was, well, not the keyboard, but using a mouse. I promise you, we spent a whole day on teaching them how to use a mouse. So I'm getting too far in the weeds on that, but.
No, I don't think so. I think we should establish probably that this was quite a while back, and it's not that you're disparaging women. You're just saying that at the time when this occurred, that administratively, there was not a lot of computer training, and they just didn't have expertise with the computer.
Yes. And so I want to clarify, this was in the early 90s. I mean, the internet, at the time, I remember teaching a class on what is the internet and how to use Netscape.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that was a while ago.
Yeah. And getting people to understand that Microsoft Word and Microsoft Windows were two different technology. One was a operating system. So this was in the early days of not the early days of personal computers, but these were people that didn't have computer classes in high school.
Right.
They were focused on doing their job. They were the problem solvers. They selected these people based on their skills, their interactive human problem solving skills, and said, okay, we're just going to fix your technology problem so that you can be the technology expert for your county. That's quite an undertaking. That was the goal of that project, was to take these group of unskilled, no computer skills whatsoever people who were experts at what they do and say, okay, I'm going to make you a double expert. You're going to become an expert in the technology that we need. And you're going to stay an expert in what we do, and you're going to become an expert in the technology that we need. And I'm going to educate you, and we're going to grow you into this. And that, if we had not had the project sponsor, if we'd had a hands-off project sponsor then all that would have accomplished is we would have trained these people on technology, and they would have been so frustrated at the end of it, they would have either failed or use their new skills to go job hunting and work somewhere else. But instead, we made them into county experts, and we grew them into the elite of the elite and gave them that was part of his project, was to grow them and create an atmosphere where they can grow and develop and become successful. And if in a hands-off project sponsor situation, you have the opposite impact, where you would have had an incredible turnover of a different project sponsor, because it was a very difficult task. And it was, if you were to interview those people, most of them stayed there till to retirement. They would tell you that he was critical, because they were in an antagonistic type relationship with their centralized data services department. And he was the glue that brought everybody on the same page.
So without naming names, can you go, we will protect the guilty here. We can praise praise the innocent and protect the guilty here. But so can you give me some examples of really poor project sponsorship?
Oh yeah. I have one, and let me say, I have the utmost respect for this person. I'm not going to name him, but, and I'm not 100% sure he was the original project sponsor, but he was the director. And I'm the director, the top dog. And it was a project that would spent $2.8 million, and it failed. It didn't work. And at the beginning, no one could understand why it didn't work. I came on board, and you realize, first of all, that it has no direction. It's finally got a new project manager who's now on the ball. He comes from military background, and he is all in PMP, and he's trying to put processes in place. And but he's got no leadership from above that has an understanding of what is the goal of this project. And this project was a multi-department project. It was actually a multi-agency project, but it failed miserably.
I think I know which project this is. And fortunately for me, I didn't have anything to do with it.
Well, what became clear to me when the project failed so miserably that lawyers on both sides were involved, because you had lawyers from the technology partner that's providing the project, and there was multiple technology partners. That's your first mistake, is there wasn't a single point of, I usually refer to a single point of contact as a single point of failure, but there was no single point of accountability either. But what became clear to me at the beginning is that no one actually knew what the goal was. The project itself didn't have any goals. It just had this beautiful wish list of, we wish you could sprinkle fairy dust on this and everything would be great. And so the project was doomed from the beginning because it had no direction, it had no goals. And you had a subject matter expert who, was a loose cannon and was able to, because he was the one that understood the technology, and because those above him didn't understand the technology, they didn't understand the goals, no one had a vision, he was able to just run loose with it and do whatever he wanted. And that to the tune of $2.8 million, just wasted. And once we had someone in the middle, project manager and a functional manager that were working together, and then they brought some new staff on and tasked me with taking over as subject matter expert, I started becoming aware of, okay, I don't understand what we're trying to do and what's our vision. And we started bringing the heads of the departments in and having meetings and getting understanding of what's our goal. And, well, how would we know that's our goal? Because it's not even in our project charter. I mean, and we revised it and we got it operational. It wasn't successful yet, but it became operational. But what's interesting is I got the privilege to attend an executive team meeting. And this is important because I think that this is the culture in many places. And in this meeting, everyone was sitting around a table with the head guy at the top. It would be like if you used to watch the Trump show. I can't even remember what name of his show was called.
The Apprentice.
Okay, yeah. You have Trump at the end of the table, and then you have all the apprentices there. Everyone comes there with a happy report to pat him on the back and tell him all his ideas are great and everything is wonderful. I was shocked because I was the only non-executive in that meeting. And they're all saying, oh, this is wonderful and this is good and this is good. And I realized they're just sucking up to him and they're telling him what he wants to hear because they're protecting themselves from each other and from whatever. And when it came my turn, because he wanted an update, I started with, well, that's not going to work. And you should have seen the room. Everyone at that was terrified of what was going to come out of my mouth. And I could see, if they could kick me under the table, they would have. And I could.
Reputation.
I know. And so, of course, I changed my demeanor because I realized, okay, my boss is also sitting in the room and I can hear in my mind, he's telling me you're being disrespectful, tone it down. So I changed it to some information that you might not have, instead of, because it was his idea.
Right.
And some information that you might not have is this. And because of this problem, this thing over here, isn't going to work on that timeline or whatever it was. But it became clear to me that day, no one had ever spoken to him that way before. And from that day on, he contacted me. I was just the subject matter expert. I was not the project manager. He contacted me directly on a regular basis for updates and to go over it. And he and the project manager and I went over things together. And he started becoming more involved. And it wasn't until he started becoming more involved that I started understanding the big picture vision for this project. Because until then, I was somewhere in the weeds and I knew why it didn't work. And I could see some middle management, but I didn't have, and that was critical. He brought the 10,000 foot level to me so that I could see the importance of it. And I brought okay, that's pie in the sky and that's wonderful, but down here on earth, things don't happen that way. But at the beginning, he was insulated. There was a layer of insulation. He's a project manager just saying, I want this cool thing to happen. You have to have someone in the middle, but you also have to have that ongoing interaction. You can't have, well, I gave you $10,000. I gave you $2 million. Why don't you have it working yet?
It's interesting to me as you talk about this that he started coming to you as a subject matter expert. Where do you think the project manager's role in that was?
In fairness to the project manager on that project manager had been handed the project as a mess. It wasn't his project originally, and he was added to the project literally a week before I was. So he was having to insert himself in that to define a role. But previously, so the project sponsor, I think, had left out the project manager before because it was failing, and he was dealing with the other subject matter expert who just making stuff up. And so we did have a disconnect, but there was no.
It sounds like he was continuing that with the new project manager, which, I would never advise that. He was going to leave the new project manager out too. So
yes.
Are you saying that you helped to facilitate the new project manager becoming integrated?
I would say it's both. I helped the new project manager become integrated, and the project manager started involving me at a level that legitimizing my involvement. Because before, the project manager was left out, and this project manager, when he first came on, he could see that the other subject matter expert, he was beginning to suspect there was a problem there, and he was he was working against that, but the relationship between the director and the subject matter expert was already kind of solid. And, in the absence of any feedback of this is not managing well and this is not going well, there was nothing to break that up. And so I helped the project manager, but he helped me equally, because I could have very, very easily just went down the same path.
Well, I want to ask a question because,
Yeah.
With your personality, and you're a real get it done girl. And I think that's something that we share. And I think that my experience has been that both of us, whenever there was a void, have filled the void if that was what removed the barrier from the completion, right? If ever you were a part of a project and there was a void and you pointed to the void and that didn't get filled by someone else, you would help fill it for the sake of the project. But
Yes.
ultimately, so you're talking about being a person that's going to come help fill in, you know, different roles. And people can take issue with that, you know, because, you know, in many organizations and just from a pure project management standpoint, you know, that's outside of the authority of the subject matter expert many times. Some of the things you're talking about doing
Yes.
is beyond the role many times of the subject matter expert. So standing from the outside, looking at a project functioning like that you're not involved in, not trying to help, you know, fill in the gaps for people in their roles performing. What would you say to a project manager that came into a project where, you know, the sponsor talks directly to the implementers, right? And does an end run around the project manager?
Oh, I would tell them that's a problem. I mean, and I recognized that it was a problem in my situation and tried to manage it and reduce it and redirect it. But most of the time, your subject matter expert isn't going to do that, or they're going to be unresponsive. And it causes multiple problems because, one, you don't speak the same language. You're the project manager up here, and your subject matter expert lives in the weeds. They understand you know, especially when it's technology, they understand the constraints and the rules of the technology that you're using and what it can do and what it can't do. And they're
maybe the rules of the game of the project itself, you
yes,
know, where maybe
yeah, depending
in
on the
some
role, yeah,
roles.
definitely. But they're not aware of the vision, and you can misguide each other. Well, first of all, that's time consuming, and that's time. They're the person that's supposed to be getting the work done, and if they're
Managing the
the
project or the communication on the project.
yeah, that's really not their role. And when the project manager is in the middle and bringing everybody together, and you know, and in a lot of ways, I remember being shocked. I felt like when I became a project manager that I didn't really have very much work to do anymore. I mean, I did, but it was weird because suddenly it's not my job to do analysis. It's not my job to do programming. It's not my job to do anything with data. It is my job to coordinate all these things to make sure that my team has the things they need and they understand the vision. And it's my job to understand their obstacles and concerns and issues and then present that to the sponsor and say, you know, given this problem, and this is an insurmountable problem, I don't think we can fulfill your vision exactly like you know, what are you trying to accomplish? And let's redirect. And it's their job to keep the eyes on the goal, not on the prescribed task. And I say that because that's the other thing that causes projects to fail is when, and we've seen this, I mean, I can give you examples of this that have nothing to do with project management, is when, you know, a project typically is trying to solve a problem. It's trying to provide a solution to a well-defined problem. But often it's not a well-defined problem, or often the project sponsor said, oh, I have a solution in search of a problem and I want you to do it. And when you have a sponsor that is getting down in the weeds and talking with a subject matter expert, they're more likely to start prescribing the solution. And then the person in the weeds is going to say, okay. And then that's when you have projects that run on $2.8 million because there's no one in the middle saying, okay, everybody, let's back up. Let's discuss our roles. Okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Because the person at the top, I shouldn't say at the top because they're not necessarily at the top. The sponsor can easily have their focus ruined by that ongoing communication straight with the subject matter expert because they can lose track of the vision. Maybe not always, maybe they don't, but it's a critical role that the project sponsor keeps the project manager involved, and the project sponsor's job is to keep focus on the vision and the goal and the direction and to communicate that with the project manager. And the project manager's job is to be that middleman that keeps the project in the direction it needs to go, but, you know, communicates back and forth on.
Yeah, it sounds like, you know, what you're alluding to with this project sponsor is that they were actually dabbling in the management of the project themselves,
They were.
rather than being the role of
Yes.
the sponsor, truly the role of the sponsor. So my final question for you is, what would you say, or what would you recommend to a project manager? Because, you know, a lot of times when we talk about project management and, you know, size of projects and methodologies and recommendations for managing and, you know, dealing with your team and things like that, we never really talk about and you brought this up, the times when you come in as a project manager to an existing project. That sounds terrible to me. That sounds
It
like
is. It's difficult. And in fairness, I only had, so in my role as a project manager, all of my projects were inherited, with the exception of one. And my projects were large. I mean, I had a project that was a little over $6 million project. It had been going on for several years. It had been through 5 project managers.
I think that you and I both, in situations like that, and a lot of project managers, you know, your mind goes to the problem solving of what's taking place in this project and between the people of the project. And so some project managers, you know, with strong authoritarian styles may approach, you know, the team members with that style, perhaps to say, you know, I'm the project manager and my guys are going to listen to me.
Yeah, that's
or maybe you have to, it's going to fail, right?
Yeah, so the first thing you have to do is you have to get the buy-in of everybody, and you have to identify who has the buy-in of the project and wants it to succeed and who doesn't care anymore. And then you've got to identify who are the people that are like, oh yeah, you're this one. You're just another project manager. We've been through 5 of you. We know what we're doing. Just you're in our way. You have to lead these people. They don't answer to you. You're not their boss. But you have to lead them, and you cannot lead them if they don't see you as a legitimate leader. If you come in there with authoritative attitude, then what's going to happen is they're going to find a way to get off your project, and you're going to be stuck with someone else who knows less, who's less of an expert, and which may or may not be a good thing. But the ideal situation is try to get the experts to come around and want to follow you and want to.
And what's the project sponsor's role in that? How much of that is their responsibility?
It is their responsibility, but they can't do it if you don't have the skills to command respect. They're not going to accomplish it either, especially when you're in a large organization where. So I have a project that specifically comes to mind, and you know, I was probably in my early 30s at the time, so I'm younger than most of the leadership that's in my project, because most of my project, it was a very large project, and it was a very critical project, and it was a lot of management persons involved in the project, as well as workers from multiple departments. And they didn't respect any of the previous project managers. They didn't respect my boss at all. And the sponsors of the project were outside of the organization because it was a project that was mandated to the organization to accomplish. So the sponsors are legislative people. But you have there's a face with that, but he's very disconnected and doesn't understand technology and doesn't understand what to do, but he understands the needs and concerns. And they don't respect him either, because these are all people that live in the weeds, and he doesn't know how we do this. And it's a culture of the wild, wild west. And you have to, I mean, it truly is. I mean, I can tell you my very first meeting because I, said, we're going to have a kickoff meeting because I need to be introduced to all these people, and I need to know what I'm dealing with, and they all need to know me and who I am. And I lay it all out there on the table, and just, it's what is the nature of the universe. I need to know what the universe is, and I'm just taking over here. And very first thing I said, I'm just trying to get organized. Okay, where are we? And, one of them pops off and says, well, we have weekly status reports. You can go read them. And, when I said, no, I need to understand, like, what obstacles do you have and what problems are we having? And a grown man, almost twice my age, who's been with the agency for a long time, who's the head of the department, who has 7 or 8 men answered him, leans back in his chair with his arms crossed and says, I'm not answering any questions until I get my answers. And I realized, okay, we have a little turf war inside the project from departments of, and I said, okay, that's great. Tell me your questions and let's get you some answers. And that moment was a defining moment for that project. I was exhausted at the end of that. It was a 3-hour meeting, and we got his questions written up on the board, and he still didn't cooperate with me till probably.
Which role were you in? You were the project manager?
I was the project manager. I was project manager number 6.
And what was his role?
He was just
a stakeholder?
Yes. He was a stakeholder. He was also a functional manager for a big.
One of the project team people?
Yeah.
He was their functional manager?
He's the functional manager for a large section of the project, because this project involved data security and so it touched across. This project was large. I mean, it spanned beyond the scope of this agency, and it was critical. So, it touched across hardware people, and
so, I mean, it was multi.
It was not building software. It was we might as well have been standing up a building and installing. I mean, it touched the physical needs as well as the hardware needs and the software needs. And yeah, it was because it was a security project.
If I can summarize, then what you're telling me is you're giving an example of that sometimes in trying to get to the bottom of a situation or resolve an issue, sometimes you're just going to have to you're going to have to do the work. A 3-hour session of everybody revealing why they're angry or frustrated or whatever, is sometimes what you're going to have to do. And unfortunately, if you've come aboard as project manager number 6, there's probably a lot of that. Maybe the early days of your project, that's all you do.
It was all that you did for like a month. That was probably all I accomplished. But I was able to understand, like, there were some that were refusing to cooperate anymore because this need over here is in direct conflict of this requirement over here. And you have a person whose job it is to say, we have to meet these requirements, and these are serious requirements. The feds or the IRS says we have to do it this way. And another person over here says, as long as you're doing it, as long as you have that way you're doing it, my thing's not going to work. And how do we meet in the middle? And it's up to the project sponsor to be the one to say this or that is an acceptable risk. And
that's exactly what I think where we started is, what is their role? Because exactly as you've indicated, the weeds, right? The doing of the project, and sometimes the merry path that leads you on. And it's the sponsor who says, I'm okay with that, or I'm not okay with that. We'll accept that risk, but and provide that reorientation back to the goal so that the team can move forward.
Yes, and until we accomplish that once we accomplish that, we move forward, and we move forward in lightning speed. And it was just, it was incredible, and it was impressive. And the dynamics of the team started. I mean, you still had your little fiefdoms and the pissing contests, but the dynamics changed. But prior to that, I had 2 very strong persons who both were stakeholders, who the nature of their jobs are opposed. Because basically one guy's job is to hold the door open and let people in, and the other guy's job is to keep the door closed and keep the danger out. So they're in direct conflict in the first place. And they both felt like, nobody's listening to me. I can't do my job because of that other guy. And that happens. Not usually that pronounced, not usually that ugly, but that happens frequently on a project where you need direction from the project sponsor. And once the project sponsor says to, we'll call him Jim Bob, oh, wow, I understand the risk you're explaining to me. And okay, thank you, thank you so much for explaining that. And I see that this is a risk. We're going to be willing to accept this. Jim Bob was like, okay, cool, because it's no longer his butt that's going to be crucified for accepting that risk.
I wanted to thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd just say that thank you. Obviously, Jim Bob is from the South. But that's what makes these stories fun. And I wanted to thank you for sharing, because I really feel like we brought up several topics to explore for next time, talking about communication and doing the work with team members. But hopefully, this highlighting the importance of the sponsor and how a sponsor can help the project become unstuck will help other projects that maybe we're not involved with in the future, but a lot of other people are, maybe they're stuck right now, and that's all they need is the project sponsor to step in. Well, thanks again, and I really appreciate you talking with us about this today, and hopefully you'll come join us in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Connie.